Hi folks, it's Andy, the Analytical Preacher. I am frequently asked why Bible-based or evangelical Christians have tended to affiliate more over time with the Republican Party than with the Democratic Party. A lot of the folks asking the question are honestly saying, it seems to us that the platform of the Democrats, things like standing up for fairness, looking out for the most vulnerable in society, align exactly with biblical values. In fact, aligns with the exact sort of things that your church is trying to do in the community in which you preach and teach. And some others have just said to me, they see Donald Trump's behavior and it's unappealing to them, or it's outright appalling to them, and they want to know why. And I begin by explaining, of course, that the connection between evangelical Bible-based Christians and the Republican Party goes back more than 100 years before Trump. So Trump has nothing to do with the connection or the affiliation. Now, Bible-based evangelical Christians will never say all Republicans are good and all Democrats are bad. Everything about Republicans is right. Everything about Democrats is wrong. We say nothing of the sort. And we certainly don't. I'm certainly not going to defend Donald Trump in any way in this podcast or anywhere else. But the truth is, it's not an illusion. It is a fact that over decades and decades and decades, Bible-based evangelicals have tended to favor the Republican Party, though there are certain parts of the platform of the Democratic Party that are very appealing to us. As I go through this podcast, you may agree or disagree with every word that I say. And I'm not really trying to argue with you about this. I'm just objectively answering the question I am asked. And I think because our politics have become so contentious and because Donald Trump seems to be such a odd choice for Christians, I'm asked with increasing frequency, why is there this association? Why is there this affiliation between Bible-believing Christians, Bible-based Christians, and Republicans? And again, it's not an illusion. It is true. So let me objectively explain, based on the conversations that I have every week, month, year with Bible-based evangelical Christians, why that is. So let me address it from 4 different angles to make sure we cover all of the ground here. I'll lay them out real quick and then we'll just go through them one by one. First, I'll discuss the relevant historical background because, again, the association is a long time. I'll highlight some of the main philosophical, some of the main ideological differences between the two parties and how that's relevant to the Christian affiliation with Republicans. We'll kind of breeze by and talk about our old friends' moral objectivism versus moral relativism. One can get bogged down in a philosophical conversation there. We will not do that, but we will have to take a trip by there to better understand this issue. And then we will talk about the most vulnerable in society. We will talk about that part of the platform that seems most relevant to the conversation. So number 1, the historical background. Before there was a Republican Party. So you're going back now to the early 1800s. What you would call Bible-believing or evangelical Christians. So in other words, not Catholics and not really the mainline Protestants like Presbyterians or Episcopalians, but sort of those Bible-based evangelical Christians. Those individuals were already involved in trying to influence a number of things in society. Primary among them was working against slavery, but there were other things. There were child labor reforms. There was prison reform. There was getting education for the poor masses. Christians were working on all of those things, and based in large part on one verse in the first chapter of the first letter to Timothy, where Paul explains that those engaged in the slave trade were working contrary to what he calls the glorious gospel of God. And so because Paul said those involved in the slave trade, that would be kidnapping slaves, that would be selling slaves, buying slaves, using slaves that had been kidnapped or bought or sold against their will at some previous point. Again, not as a prisoner of war, not as punishment for some crime they had committed on a chain gang, but someone who had been involved in what we in America would call the slave trade. They were working against the glorious gospel of God. And so it was natural that Bible-based Christians would be associated with the political parties that were working against slavery. Those were the Free Soil Party and certain elements of the Whig Party. In 1854, the Free Soil Party and those elements of the Whig Party, they joined up and they formed what was called, or is still called, the Republican Party. And they stood in opposition to the pro-slavery Democrat Party. Wide range of views in that Republican Party. Were they trying to just stop slavery from spreading farther into new territories? Were they trying to eliminate slavery altogether? But the platform of this new Republican Party, which came out of the merger of the Free Soil and the Whig parties in 1854, the platform was essentially an opposition to slavery platform, which again stood in contrast to the pro-slavery platform of the Democrats. And then after the close of the Civil War, again, these Bible-based evangelical Christians continued to work with the Republican Party. There were these so-called radical Republicans in Congress, in the House and in the Senate. And these radical Republicans worked to fulfill Lincoln's dream of a Reconstruction program in the South. And so Bible-based evangelical Christians were working with the Republicans on this Reconstruction in the South. And Democrats in those days literally fought Reconstruction every step of the way. And so we saw then, the 1870s, the 1880s, Republicans were the first of the two parties to send black delegates to their national convention to elect black representatives or black senators to serve in the Congress in Washington, D.C., etc. If anything, the bond got even tighter in the years after the Civil War, because after Reconstruction ended prematurely in the South, Lincoln had died, and the gentleman who took over president after him essentially brought Reconstruction to a close probably much too early. After Reconstruction in the South, prior to the civil rights laws of the 20th century, we saw restrictive laws put in place. And in the Southeast came to be known as Jim Crow laws. We saw restrictive laws put in place that essentially were saying, if we cannot hold blacks in slavery any longer, we will at least limit their freedom as much as possible. And the history books tell us every single Jim Crow law that was passed with a Democrat majority. Every single Jim Crow law that was enforced over the 80-year period that paradigm reigned in the South, every single Jim Crow law was enforced by Democrats. Now, I'm not saying that Republicans have a clean record here. I'm not saying that at all. If you look at the Republican record relative to Native Americans or relative to certain immigrant populations like Irish Catholics or the Chinese, etc., the Republican record doesn't look any better than the Democratic record. There's no question about that. But this issue of slavery and then Reconstruction and Jim Crow laws really just forced and built a strong bond between the Bible-believing evangelical Christians and the Republican Party. And what's not so often known by students of history today, which is a little surprising, is that in the 1950s and the 1960s, when Congress was working on and voting on what we call the civil rights legislation, pushed heavily, of course, by folks from Rosa Parks to MLK to Ralph David Abernathy, as those civil rights laws were working through Congress, in every case, a higher percentage of Republicans voted to approve those laws than did Democrats. Now, it's not just one piece of legislation. If you go back and look at the history of it, the House would approve a bill. More Republicans would vote for it than Democrats. They would send it to the Senate. The Senate would say, we don't like exactly the structure of this bill. We want to change these three things. We'll make the changes. We'll vote. More Republicans voted for it than Democrats. We'll send it back to the House. The House will say, yes, we can accept your version of it with those three changes. We'll vote again. More Republicans voted for it than did Democrats. So each law that was passed, whether it started in the House or in the Senate, was usually sent to the other. Some adjustments were made. A revote was taken. It was sent back. Once it came, they had to vote again. And in every single one of those votes, for every single one of those laws, Republicans voted at a higher percentage of yes than did the Democrats. And only after those laws were passed did we see a switch, when then the Democrats said, okay, if we can't enslave them and we can't hold them down with Jim Crow laws, then we better figure out a way to begin to work with them and to get them on our side. But historically, the bond was just so strong between black freedom and the Republican Party that it drew in all of those individuals who had been working against slavery and abolition from a Christian standpoint all along. And beyond the natural partnership that just sort of evolved historically there is a huge philosophical, ideological issue. There's a major split between the two parties, and it really goes this way. At the most basic level, the Bible teaches us that humans are not perfect, and this is important, and they're not perfectible. That's what the Bible teaches us about human nature. So the Bible says when we see a problem, when we see crime, or when we see other issues in society, those problems are coming from the hearts, from inside the people, not from society or the culture or the institutions that we have, but from the people individually, their hearts within themselves. But there are a number of people, philosophically, ideologically, who have always believed that humans at their core are good, and that humans essentially have to be taught to do bad things, to be greedy or to be bigoted or whatever. Otherwise, humans are good and we have a moldable nature. And so the priority in governing becomes we need to build institutions, design society and culture in such a way that man's best nature is released, as opposed to the current society, the current institutions we have, which seem to be making bad people out of otherwise relatively innocent creatures. If you believe that most of the problems are that there's not the proper system of institutions in place, there's not the proper culture in place, if you believe that's the biggest problem in society, then you work toward building that utopian future. You don't really worry about trade-offs. You don't worry, well, if we do this, it may cure this problem, but are there unintended consequences? You don't worry about those things as much. So at a very high level, you would say the Republican Party tends to agree more with the Bible philosophically there. The Republican Party says there is no perfect human, there is no perfect government, neither can be perfected. Part of the role of government will always be to provide disincentives for bad behavior, to even punish bad behavior, to provide positive incentives for good behavior, but always knowing that there will be trade-offs. There will be unintended consequences because, again, the people are not perfect and they're not perfectible. And whatever rules we put in place or institutions we build in society, because they're made up of people, will also not be perfect or perfectible. This is hardly just a Christian, non-Christian philosophical debate. In his book, The Conflict of Visions, Thomas Sowell talks about exactly this, but from a secular view, not from a Christian view. But again, this idea of if you think individual people can be bad and greedy and bigoted, then you deal with it differently than if you think, no, it's the institutions that society has that is making those individuals that way. First, fix the institutions, perfect the institutions, and that will allow this perfectible nature of humans to be brought out. And if you see the world in one of those two ways, it will starkly change. And so part of what Sowell is trying to say in The Conflict of Visions is, how is it that we can see the same set of facts and the same events in society, and one party comes to this conclusion and another party comes to the exact opposite 180 conclusion? How can that be? And Sowell says, because it's how we view society and where the issues in society come from. And the Bible would say that's exactly what it is. And people are not perfect and they are not perfectible. And so government needs to address it from that standpoint. Because we don't think people are perfect or perfectible, because we don't think any institution can be perfect or perfectible, Christians are really, really interested in competition. So it could be competition for school choice. We want to see public schools, private schools, Christian schools, charter schools, homeschool. And again, that idea aligns better generally with Republicans. We have the same issue even with party choice, with businesses. Evangelical Bible-based Christians tend to prefer smaller businesses that create more competition. And we see generally, now this is generally, Republicans tend to favor larger companies, and Republicans tend to be much more lenient with what they will allow, say, for mergers and acquisitions. So in that area, Christians would actually tend much more so to favor the Democrats' position. We want smaller businesses. We want increased competition. We're very afraid of monopolies or duopolies. We take a very skeptical view of mergers and acquisitions. Is that really being done for the benefit of society and the consumer, or is it being done to allow increased pricing power for the merger as they eliminate the pricing power, the pricing competition of the mergee? And even in voting for a party, because we believe that no person is perfect, therefore no political party could be perfect, we believe in competition between the parties. I do not believe that Christ would say 100% of all political offices in local, state, and federal level should be held by this party or that party. In fact, I think Christ would say just the opposite. If a single party comes to dominate the political scene overall, that party is simply going to become increasingly corrupt, period. And even if a party only holds sway with a certain subpopulation, if this party or that party says, we know all Bible-based evangelical Christians always vote for us 100%, the fear, of course, would be that that party would then become very non-responsive to that subpopulation. And so this idea about competition sort of bends back on the idea that Christians tend to affiliate with the Republican Party, because when it comes to business competition and when it comes to even which political parties are voted to hold and maintain power, Christians are going to be much more open for increased competition. I said that we would quickly mention moral objectivism versus moral relativism. Again, I'm not interested in some philosophical dispute, but those who believe in the Bible tend to think, obviously, that there are objective, universal, absolute truths in the world. And part of what conservatives do in every society where there's a conservative political movement is they're saying that they believe there are values, that there are objective truths that are worth conserving in society. And so some believe that as we grow, as we enlighten ourselves and improve, that not only does our scientific knowledge and our technology improve, but our moral good improves as well. And so what may have been right or wrong in one time period, or what may be right or wrong in one culture, may not be right or wrong in a different culture or in a different time period. Christians are very hesitant about that idea because, again, we believe there are absolute right and wrongs. Let me give you a couple of examples. In the early or the mid-1800s, Republicans would have said slavery is wrong and abortion is wrong. And today, 200 years later, Republicans would say slavery is wrong and abortion is wrong. But in the early mid-1800s, Democrats were saying slavery is okay, but abortion is horribly wrong. Today, Democrats have switched. They now think slavery is this abhorrent, unbelievable evil, even to the point that reparations need to be made for that horrible evil. But today they say abortion is mostly okay. Years ago, in America's colleges, blacks were excluded, and then Jews were excluded. Today, blacks are not excluded, but it seems as if whites and Asians sometimes are excluded. And again, Christians are going, but if something was always right, it was always right, and if it was always wrong, it was always wrong. So Evangelical Christians, Bible-based Christians, were one of the groups that helped to work in opening up Antioch College. And that happened in 1852, so a couple of years before there was a Republican Party and a decade or so before there was a civil war over the issue of slavery. Evangelical Christians worked to open Antioch College. And within a decade of its founding, again, 1852, think about the culture in 1852. Within a decade of its founding, Antioch College was admitting women and black individuals with the same criteria, equal footing with white male students. Antioch College was one of the first colleges to have female professors teaching women, blacks, and white male students in the same classroom, same material, at the same time. Christian colleges today still admit women and blacks and white male students, and they still have diverse faculties. But our other colleges and universities have changed. And again, at one point, blacks and Jews may have been excluded. Today, they may be trying to dial down the number of Asians, etc. But if something is right, it's right. It was right in 1852, and it's right in 2024. If it was wrong in 1852, then it's wrong in 2024. So let me close then by talking about the most vulnerable in society, because we know from the history books, if you go back to the earliest Christ followers in the Roman Empire, so just a few years, a few decades after Christ had died and resurrected, Peter and Paul are starting new churches in the Roman Empire in places like Jerusalem and in what today would be Greece and Turkey, etc. From the very earliest Christ followers in the Roman Empire, Christians were involved in helping those in need. They were always on the forefront and usually were leading the way, sometimes the only ones involved in things such as starting the first orphanages in the world, working for prison reform, working against slavery, working to attain education for the masses, working against child labor, supporting women's rights to vote, voting for civil rights legislation, etc., etc., etc. So it is absolutely a fact. Christians have always been involved in helping those vulnerable in society. The Bible tells us in the Old and New Testament over and over, support orphans and widows, support those most vulnerable in society, those who are in the most need through no fault of their own. But as I said, Christians believe humans are not perfect and are not perfectible, and therefore Christians are constantly checking each other for our selfish motives. We read books like When Helping Hurts so that we can challenge each other. Am I really trying to help the individual, or am I just trying to make myself feel better, easing a guilty conscience, virtue signaling to the society around me, etc.? Because we do not think there is a single perfect solution, we are very cognizant about trade-offs, and we worry ourselves whether we're making a difference or whether we're causing more harm than we are good. And I would think that most of us would agree, by any measure, it is hard to call what we call the Great Society programs of the 1960s. It is hard to call those programs a success. It's easy to say that you believe the intention of the politicians and all of those, including a great number of Christians. It's easy to say the intention of the politicians and the Christians who worked to develop the Great Society programs were absolutely clean and selfless. But if you look at what the poverty rate was when those programs started and where the poverty rate is today, after billions and billions of dollars has been spent, the poverty rate, though it's gone up some and gone down some, it's essentially where it was in the very beginning. And the real concerning issue to Christians is some of the programs seem to have actually caused harm. For example, the poorest counties in the country, when the Great Society programs were first implemented, were in Appalachia, Southeast Kentucky, Southwest West Virginia. Today, the poorest counties in the country are in Southeast Kentucky and Southwest Virginia in the Appalachian Mountains. And if anything, the government welfare seems to be driving an opioid epidemic that has just anchored that region in Appalachia in just this desperate situation in which the residents just say there's no way out. We can go from Appalachian Mountains to our inner cities, and we can see federal programs that were designed to lift people up and to break the cycle of poverty, if anything, seem to be reinforcing cycles of perpetual poverty. And unfortunately, they seem to be simultaneously implying to young black men that they are disposable. The federal government, the state government can provide a check that does everything a young black husband or young black father could do. Absolute worst possible thing we could say. worst implication that we could put out there. And so Christians are going, we have to look at these programs. We have to stop the opioid epidemic. We have to break this cycle of perpetual poverty. We have to tell young black men, you might be the most important subpopulation in America. You're certainly not a disposable subpopulation in America. And we fear that politicians now, if someone says, let's reform, when Bill Clinton, much to his credit and in a highly successful effort, when Bill Clinton tried to reform welfare, he was roundly, aggressively criticized by the far left wing of his party. Republicans and Christians were on board. Let's reform welfare. Bill Clinton did reform welfare, and it made a difference. Poverty got better. People went to work. Young black men became more involved in their families. It was a beautiful thing. But again, he was roundly criticized for it. Ultimately, some politician says, Bill Clinton's mean, and the Republican candidate is mean, and I want to take you individuals in Appalachia, and I want to give you more government money back. And they did it for selfish reasons to get votes, and we ultimately are afraid that we may be hurting people with government money. So we do agree with the Democratic platform that we should be assisting the most vulnerable in society. Sometimes the Republican platform goes too far, and it simply says everybody just needs to pull themselves up from their bootstraps. Here's an example of somebody born in poverty who's now a business owner and a millionaire, and you ought to be able to do that too. And there's not enough concern for the vulnerable in society who are going to be held by a ceiling from doing what you're talking about doing. And so the Democratic platform of assisting the most vulnerable in society, as opposed to the general Republican platform of everybody on their own, is appealing theoretically to evangelical Christians. But we're afraid that the way the Great Society programs have evolved, that they are honestly doing more harm than they are good. So again, as I said, you may agree or disagree with the reasons that are stated in this podcast. You may say that those are not nearly enough reasons to justify why Bible believers, why Christians would support Republicans. And you may want to argue every single point in great detail with me. I'm not here to really argue the points. I speak to evangelical Christians every single day. I speak to conservative Christians. I speak to Bible-based Christians every single week, every single month. These are the reasons that they tell me they are more anchored to the Republican Party. These are the reasons why they do vote for Democrats in this occasion or that occasion, and these are the reasons why they do not. Again, this is not an endorsement of the Republican Party. The party has glaring and shameful weaknesses that need to be addressed. And if you are a Bible-based believer who works aggressively for the Republican Party, I would challenge you that you need to bring those weaknesses of the party up, and you need to have those weaknesses addressed, because that's exactly what Christians do. We never align ourselves with an organization and then defend that organization because we're now associated with it. The Bible teaches Christians to do exactly the opposite. If you feel an association to the Republican Party, then you need to be challenging that party from the inside to be better, to be more Christian and more Bible-based. And in either case, Christians should always, whether it's within the Republican Party or whether it's across the two different parties, or even perhaps a third party, Christians should always be interested in creating more competition, because whoever your favorite political leader is, whatever your favorite political party is, that leader's imperfect, that party's imperfect, and they need to be kept in check. And Christians sometimes are one of the few subpopulations in society willing to stand up and check those around us rather than just identifying with the one we identify with, circling the wagons and blaming everything on the enemy. So I aggressively charge evangelicals today, hold your political party accountable and always work for increased competition. Thanks for listening. Until next time, this is Andy.